Hello everybody, Mr. Forshee here. So we have talked about realism. We've read a great realist novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, and this week we are going to look at two American poets who are influenced by that movement and stand as transitional figures from the realism of the 19th century to the modernism of the 20th century. And they are Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. So we're going to start today with Walt Whitman. And my plan here is to give you a short presentation about Whitman and his life and his poetry, and then look together with you at one of his poems, one of my favorites of his, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. All right, so I will begin. And I think that when I have it like this, my face is gone. We'll see in a minute when I look at the video. All right, I'm going to tell you a little bit today about Walt Whitman, who is sometimes called America's first modern poet, and I'll explain why. Walt Whitman was born and raised in New York. He was born in 1819, and he was born on Long Island. And his family moved to the village of Brooklyn, which was growing up, of course, nowhere near as big as it is today at the time, but a growing village there outside of Manhattan, or just across the river from Manhattan. When he was 4 years old, they moved to Brooklyn. Whitman said, quote, "His early friendships with the merchants, sailors, farmers, and fishermen of Brooklyn were my best experiences and my deepest lessons in human nature." He was born to a large working class family. So of the poets we've read so far, Whitman is our first example of a real working class poet. That's very much the persona that he adopts as a poet later in his life too. A kind of all-American vagabond poet of the working class, poet of the everyman, right? So he's born to a large family. He's the second of 9 children, named after his father, Walter, and so he's called Walt for short, so as not to confuse father and son. They were a patriotic family, evidently, because the other sons in the family were named after Andrew Jackson and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. And you can see a lot of that, just real optimism about America and the promise of America and what America represents for the everyman in Whitman's poetry. Whitman's home life was pretty unstable because of his family's poverty. His father was a carpenter, and when they moved to Brooklyn, his father would try to make money by buying a plot of land and then building a house on it, moving the family into the house while he was fixing it up to sell, and then once he sold it, taking that and buying another plot of land. But he never seemed to be able to make this work to the family's financial advantage, and it meant they were moving around all the time when he was young. So a pretty unstable upbringing. Plus he had a rocky relationship with his father, who was a moody man and a controlling man of strong opinions. Whitman left his formal schooling at the age of 11 in order to work and help support the family. And at 11 years old, leaving school, he went to work in the newspaper business. As a boy of 11, he would be what was called the printer's devil, which was just the apprentice, the kind of the gopher of the shop. If you've ever worked, as I did when I was a boy, I was the gopher for a long time around the farm where I was raised and with my grandfather when he was building stuff. And the gopher was just the boy who got sent to go for this or that. Go for the hammer, go for the shovel, right? Go bring them here. So you were the gopher. Well, that's what Whitman was in the printing office or the printing shop as a young boy. But later in his life, he learns typesetting and works as a newspaper editor and reporter, and even at one point in his young adulthood, publishes his own newspaper. Like many good realist authors and poets, quote, he was developing much of the material and the crisp, objective reporter style that would appear later in his poetry. I made this point when we talked about realism, that many of the best writers of the period got their start as newspaper reporters. Whitman is one of those, and that style very much influences their approach to literature. They have a sort of just the facts approach to conveying a story or conveying an experience in literature. And I think you'll see that in Whitman's poetry. that observational skill that Mark Twain talks about so much. In 1848, as a young man, so he would be, well, how old is he then? 29 or so? Did I do my math right there? Yeah, looks like it. He took a cross-country trip from New York to New Orleans. And in the 19th century, this would be the cross-country trip that would kind of take in the most of the young American nation. You're going from its largest city in the north to its largest city in the south. New Orleans, like cities in the north that I mentioned when talking about realism, New Orleans too had its spike in population to come about from immigration and urbanization. In the 1830s, New Orleans doubled in size, so that by the 1840s, it was the wealthiest city in America, New Orleans was, and it was the third largest city in America. His time in New Orleans fired his imagination by showing him, and I'm quoting from your textbook here, quote, by showing him the diversity of the young nation. So he gets this cross-country trip and gets to see, it's kind of like Huck and Jim floating down the Mississippi River on the raft, gets to see a lot of American life on this trip. Including, he sees a slave auction while in New Orleans that changes his political views. As a young man, Whitman had been a free soiler, which was a party of poor whites predominantly who were against slavery for economic reasons. They were called free soilers because they wanted access to land for small amounts of land for poor farmers, and those poor farmers had a hard time competing with the very large plantation owners. And so for that reason, they were against slavery, but typically didn't express much moral qualm about the institution outside of its economic impact on their class. Well, seeing this slave auction down in New Orleans changed Whitman's view on that. And according to one source, he kept a poster from that slave auction in his room to, quote, as a reminder of the injustices taking place right here in his own country. He self-publishes his book of poetry. He begins working on poetry in the 1840s as he's continuing to work in newspapers. And in 1855, he self-publishes a book of 12 poems in a volume called Leaves of Grass that I will tell you a little bit more about here in a second. During the Civil War, Whitman is too old, really, to serve. He's 42 years old when the war breaks out. But he does go down south from New York to Washington, D.C., and works in a hospital there, tending to the wounded. He was a great admirer of Abraham Lincoln's, Whitman was. In fact, two of his most frequently anthologized poems were both written on the death of Lincoln, and one is "O Captain, My Captain," which you may have heard before or memorized perhaps as a middle schooler or elementary schooler, or if you've ever seen the movie The Dead Poets Society, that's the poem that they say to the teacher in that movie, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." That's a Whitman poem addressed to Abraham Lincoln. And then the other great poem of his on the death of Abraham Lincoln is called "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed." So let's talk about Whitman's poetry for a little bit. There he is as an older man. This picture is the frontispiece here. When he first published Leaves of Grass, that was his picture in the front of the book. And so at that point, he's, 36 years old, I suppose. And this is a photograph of him later in his life. His greatest work in his life is Leaves of Grass. That's the title of his book of poetry. He published it first in 1855, a volume of 12 poems. And I'll tell you a little bit more about those poems in a minute. But this is a work that he continued to expand and revise throughout his life. So over 9 editions, in fact. And the last one was published the year of his death, 1892. And it's called the deathbed edition of his poetry. Once it was completed, he wrote to a friend of his, quote, "L of G, Leaves of Grass, at last complete, after 33 years of hacking at it. All times and moods of my life, fair weather and foul, all parts of the land, and peace and war, young and old. So it's his great magnum opus, the great work of his life. He continues working on it throughout his life. And finally, with the deathbed edition of 1892, feels like he finally has it where he wants it to be. But in his own day, Whitman received a mixed reaction as a poet. He was not terribly popular in his own day. Most 19th century Americans found him crude, both in his style and in the content of his poetry. I'll tell you a little bit about the style in just a second. Leaves of Grass was met with appreciation, though, by some, including the American philosopher that we've talked about and whom Whitman greatly admired, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson hailed it as exactly the kind of independent, self-assured, spiritually rich writing that he, as the founder of transcendentalism, had been calling for. Most of Whitman's contemporaries, however, rejected his work as crude, both in its new style, because Whitman innovates in style. He writes a different kind of poetry than what's been written before. And people look at it and say, what is this? This looks nothing like the poetry of Longfellow, who for the 19th century American, now that was the poet that they most admired, right? It was very different looking. But also in its earthy and even sometimes sexual subject matter, it was just seen as a bit crass and not fit for publication. So Whitman was a pioneer of what's known as free verse. And free verse, remember, is poetry that is free from all limitations of rhyme and meter. So the lines can be as long as you want them to. They don't have to fit a certain metrical pattern, and they don't have to rhyme. Now, although in his own day, Whitman was met with mixed feelings or emotions, he is now seen as the most important. He and Emily Dickinson, probably the two most important 19th century American poets and forerunners of modern poetry that will be written in the 20th century. Remember that by the late 19th century, Longfellow was considered the greatest American poet. But with the changing of artistic sensibilities in the 20th century, as I've told you before, Longfellow fell out of favor. And Whitman is now recognized as one of the most influential poets in American literary history. And I think the reasons for that can be seen in something that Whitman said about his own poetry. Let's see, let me find it here. The greatest poet, Whitman says, does not moralize. He knows the soul. The process of reading is not a half sleep, but in the highest sense, an exercise, a gymnast's struggle. So you can see two things there that are very different from Longfellow's style of poetry. First of all, Whitman says the good poets, they don't moralize, they know the soul, right? And if you remember Longfellow's poetry, it very often is explicitly moralistic in the way it tells a poem, right? And Whitman doesn't do that. And again, as a realist, think about what you know about realist poets and authors. Whitman would prefer a more objective, I'll just describe what I see, right? Rather than tell you how you ought to feel about it. And that's something that in the 20th century, that approach towards poetry is more favored, and Longfellow's more intentionally, directly moralistic approach falls out of favor. Now, I like both men's poetry, but I'm trying to describe the kind of change in the predominant view over that time period. And the other thing you hear in what I just read of Whitman's is that his poetry is not as easy and accessible as Longfellow's is, right? I'll read it again. He said, the process of reading is not a half sleep, but in the highest sense, an exercise, a gymnast's struggle. It's going to take some work on your part, Whitman says. But he, several times in his poetry, addresses you, the reader, and says, I'm here with you doing this. If you miss me here, catch me elsewhere. I want to be understood by you. I want to understand you. There's a real conversational quality to Whitman's poetry, where he's thinking very consciously about you as a reader, about his readers and how they're interacting with his poetry. But he's going to ask you to work for it a little bit. He doesn't make it as easy as Longfellow did. All right, so let me get rid of this here, and okay. And let's jump over to look at one of Walt Whitman's poems, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. And this is one that I love to take with me to New York and put in my pocket as we take the ferry ride out to Liberty Island to see the Statue of Liberty. In fact, let me show you, I have a couple of cool pictures that I took doing just that. And I love to read this poem as we're riding that ferry. There's the Brooklyn Bridge that I took from that ferry boat. I took these two, and here's the Statue of Liberty approaching Liberty Island right there. And Whitman's poem, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, is a poem that imagines the speaker. Of course, we don't know if he actually wrote it while he was on the ferry or if he was at home in his writing desk thinking about the ferry ride. But it imagines the speaker on the Brooklyn Ferry going from Brooklyn into Manhattan and looking around at the people around him, at the water beneath him, and then looking forward to the people who will ride this ferry 50 and 100 and 200 years into the future. So let's read it together. And normally when we annotate poetry together, as you know, I like to read it once first and then come back and annotate, which is the better way to do it by far. But in the interest of time, keeping this video shorter, I'll just read and annotate as we go along. It kind of interrupts the flow of the poetry, and that's a shame. That's why it's better to read it and then come back and then read it again. But as I said, we'll keep it a little shorter than that. Now, I have also had to excerpt the poem. It's 9 sections, and I've cut it down to just 4 for our purposes here. Okay, this is Crossing Brooklyn Ferry by Walt Whitman. Flood tide below me, I see you face to face. Clouds of the west, sun there half an hour high. I see you also face to face. Crowds of men and women attired in the usual costumes. How curious you are to me. On the ferry boats, the hundreds and hundreds that cross, returning home, are more curious to me than you suppose. And you that shall cross from shore to shore years hence are more to me and more in my meditations than you might suppose. So he begins, flood tide below me. Now, one thing, when you're annotating online, you can highlight a word and right-click it. And if you're not sure what it means, there's this great option here called Smart Lookup that usually gives you a definition right here. Now, in this case, it didn't, but it's worth clicking the one on the bottom here, flood tide definition by Merriam-Webster. Because remember, when you're reading poetry, unlike a novel or a short story where half of the words or more that you're not sure about, you just guess from the context because there's a flow in the story that you just want to keep through, right? Well, in poetry, there are fewer words and they count for more. So if you're not sure what it means, you should look it up. Flood tide is the rising tide, right? So it doesn't just mean water, right? It doesn't mean that there is a flood. It's the rising tide when it's moving from low tide to high tide, right? Now, why is that important? I'm going to highlight that. Why is that important? Because, of course, he's looking at the water. Yes, literally and directly looking at the water. But given that he begins with this flood tide before me, and then he says, I see you face to face. Who's the you? Who's he talking? Is he talking to the water? Well, yes, but I think he's also talking to those people that years hence will cross from shore to shore. He's having one of those moments where he imagines a rising tide, not just of water, but of people into the future, right? Here I am on this boat crossing the Brooklyn Ferry. Other people are around me. They all feel, have you ever had that feeling that, I don't know quite how to describe it, but you're in a crowd of people and you feel very individual. Like you know all your own thoughts and emotions, and you feel different from everybody else around you, right? And yet you're struck with this awareness that surely they must feel the same thing too, right? They must feel different from all the people around them. I don't know, I can't describe it well, certainly not as well as Whitman does, but there's this kind of double vision of being a person in a crowd and also feeling or sensing your own individuality that Whitman captures in this poem, as we'll see in just a minute. And not just the crowd of people around you, but he's also looking forward to the crowd of people that will do this activity hundreds of years into the future and read this poem hundreds of years into the future. Right? Let's continue. The impalpable. Oh, what does that mean? Let's look it up. Smart lookup. It's going to help me out right here. Unable to be felt by touch. The impalpable sustenance of me from all things at all hours of the day. The simple, compact, well-joined scheme. Myself disintegrated. Everyone disintegrated, yet part of the scheme. The similitudes of the past and those of the future. Not sure what to make of that. Let's see. The similitudes of the past. Just going to put a comment off to the side. Past and future, similar. The similitudes of the past and those of the future. The glories strung like beads on my smallest sights and hearings, on the walk in the street and the passage over the river. The current, rushing so swiftly and swimming with me far away. The others that are to follow me, the ties between me and them. Connected with others, the ties between me and them. The certainty of others. There certainly will be others on this boat now, on this boat in the future. The life, love, sight, hearing of others. Others will enter the gates of the ferry and cross from shore to shore. Others will watch the run of the flood tide. Others will see the shipping of Manhattan north and west, the heights of Brooklyn to the south and east. Others will see the islands, large and small, 50 years hence. Others will see them as they cross, the sun half an hour high. He used that phrase up here, the sun half an hour high. They're going to be doing the same thing 50 years from now that I'm doing right now. At the same time. Where'd it go? There it is. While I'm stopping to do this here, I notice that he starts these lines all with the word others. And it's this kind of, the repetition there, that particular device, maybe you remember, is called anaphora, to begin a series of lines with the same word, but it has this kind of drumbeat effect, right? That repetition. Others will do this. Others will do that. Others will do the other thing, right? 50 years hence. And then he says 100 years hence. Or even so many 100 years hence. Others will see them, will enjoy the sunset, the pouring of the flood tide, the falling back to the sea of the ebb tide. Now, one of the reasons I really love to read this poem as you're actually crossing a ferry over the between Brooklyn and Manhattan, there, if not exactly the Brooklyn Ferry, is you get that sense that Whitman's imagining the same thing that you are imagining at that moment. That lots of other people are going to do this for hundreds and hundreds of years. And there's Whitman leaning against the rail of the ferry boat, imagining lots of other people doing this for hundreds of years into the future. And there's me leaning on the rail of the ferry boat, imagining Whitman doing this 200 years ago, right? It avails not. Time or place, distance avails not. All right, let's look that one up too. I believe it means helps. Helps or benefits. It doesn't help. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe that's how it means this line here. It avails not. Not that he needs help with any particular thing, but it doesn't matter. Time doesn't matter. Place doesn't matter. We're doing the same thing, right? We're riding this ferry. I am with you, you men and women of a generation, or ever so many generations hence. Just as you feel when you look on the river and sky, so I felt. Just as any one of you is one of a living crowd, I was one of a crowd. Just as you are refreshed by the gladness of the river and the bright flow, I was refreshed. Just as you stand and lean on the rail, yet hurry with the swift current, I stood, yet was hurried. It's a great line there because there's this kind of internal tension between standing and leaning against the rail and yet zipping along with the current, right? So there's that going on. At the same time that the larger tension is just as you do this, I did this, is present in these lines. Just as you look on the numberless masts of ships and the thick-stemmed pipes of steamboats, I looked. I, too, many a time crossed the river of old, watching the 12-month seagulls, saw them high in the air floating with motionless wings, oscillating their bodies. Saw how the glistening yellow lit up parts of their bodies and left the rest in strong shadow. Saw the slow wheeling circles and the gradual edging toward the south. Saw the reflection of the summer sun in the water. Had my eyes dazzled by the shimmering track of beams. Looked at the fine centrifugal spokes of light round the shape of my head in the sunlit water. Looked on the haze on the hills southward and southwestward. Looked on the vapor as it flew in fleeces tinged with violet. Looked toward the lower bay to notice the vessels arriving. Saw their approach. Saw aboard those that were near me. Saw the white sails of schooners and sloops. Saw the ships at anchor. The sailors at work in the rigging or out astride the spars. The round masts, the swinging motion of the hulls, the slender serpentine pennants. And so as a realist poet, he's giving us this these details meant to increase verisimilitude, that sense that this is a true-to-life moment. Of course, in Whitman's case, it actually would be. He lived in Brooklyn, rode the ferry all the time. But he's, with this building up of details repeated with that anaphora, he's giving us the sense of being there, right? This is what it's like to be there, all these little details that he sees. The white wake left by the passage, the quick, tremulous whirl of the wheels, the flag of all nations, the falling of them at sunset, the scallop-edged waves in the twilight, the ladled cups, the frolics of crests and glistening, the stretch of far growing dimmer and dimmer, the gray walls of the granite storehouse by the docks. On the river, the shadowy group, the big steam tug closely flanked on each side by the barges, the hayboat, the belated lighter. On the neighboring shore, the fires from the foundry chimneys burning high and glaringly into the night, casting their flicker of black contrasted with wild red and yellow light over the tops of houses and down into the clefts of streets. So the realist poet is giving us all of this kind of teeming life of the river there in New York. These and all else were to me the same as they are to you. I loved well those cities, loved well the stately and rapid river. The men and women I saw were all near to me, others the same, others who look back on me, because I look forward to them. It's a great line right there. I think he is imagining his readers far in the future. They look back on me, he says. You look back on me, you readers in the future, because I look forward to you. The time will come, though I stop here today and tonight. All right, I'm sorry we couldn't read the whole thing together, much less read it in New York. It's a really cool experience. But here's Whitman imagining or feeling this sense of connection to the people around him on the ferry, and then the people who throughout time, or for the next several hundred years anyway, will be doing this exact same activity. And he's aware that all of the feelings that he's feeling, the things that he's seeing as he's crossing this ferry, are the same that you, when you cross the ferry today, 100, 200, and almost 200 years into the future, feel. And so there's a lot going on there. There's Whitman's transcendentalism, right? That sense of connection between all people is present in the poem. A connection even across time and place, right? that sense that there's some kind of mystical experience to be had by paying attention to your surroundings, to your environment as you're riding a ferry. You know, it's not just like you put the earbuds in and you check out and then you get where you want to be, right? For Whitman, it's a moment to be observed and to be explored because it reveals something about the interconnectedness of people, right? In the teeming life of the city. All right, so I've got several excerpts, or not several, I've got one excerpt of Song of Myself from his Leaves of Grass, and then a couple of the shorter ones for you to read this week. All right, take care, everybody.